Welcome back to part 2 of our series on the biggest history myths that millions still believe. In this episode, we uncover another set of surprising misconceptions, from the truth about Shakespeare's authorship to the legend of Atlantis, from the mystery of Stonehenge to the myth of Marie Antoinette's famous quote. These stories have been told for centuries, but the real history is far more fascinating. Discover how propaganda, exaggeration, and storytelling shaped these myths, and why so many of us still believe them today. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure to watch it first. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next episode in this series. 31. Christopher Columbus discovered America. For generations, school children were taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Statues, holidays, and history books praised him as the bold explorer who brought the New World into existence. But this story leaves out both the people already living in the Americas and earlier European explorers. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas in 1492, he encountered thriving societies, the Taino, Arawak, and many other indigenous peoples who had inhabited the region for thousands of years. To claim that he discovered a land already filled with civilizations is misleading at best. Columbus himself never set foot on the mainland that would become the United States, spending most of his voyages in the Caribbean. Even among Europeans, Columbus was not the first. Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson reached North America around the year 1000, establishing a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in present-day Newfoundland, Canada. Archaeological evidence confirms their presence centuries before Columbus. So why does the myth persist? Partly because Columbus's voyages had massive consequences. His journeys initiated lasting contact between Europe and the Americas, setting off the Columbian exchange of goods, diseases, and people. European powers rewrote the narrative to celebrate him, ignoring indigenous perspectives. In the United States, 19th century leaders elevated Columbus as a national hero, turning him into a symbol of courage and progress. The truth is more complicated and far darker. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of colonization, exploitation, and devastating disease outbreaks that decimated indigenous populations. He did not discover America, but he did open the door to European conquest. Recognizing this distinction helps separate myth from reality and honors the peoples whose lands were never lost, only invaded. 32. Julius Caesar was born by Caesarean section. The very word Caesarean makes people think of Julius Caesar, leading to the widespread belief that the Roman general and dictator was born through this surgical procedure. But this is almost certainly false. Caesarean sections in ancient Rome were usually performed only when the mother had died or was dying in childbirth, in order to save the baby. At that time, such surgery was fatal for the mother because there were no effective methods of preventing infection or stopping blood loss. Julius Caesar's mother, Aurelia, lived long into his adulthood, which means she clearly survived his birth. The connection between Caesar and the surgery likely comes from a mix-up with etymology. Some historians once believed the procedure was named after him. In reality, the term Caesarean comes from the Latin cadere, meaning to cut. Ancient Roman law, known as the Lex Caesarea, required that if a pregnant woman died, the baby should be cut from her womb before burial. Over time, people may have linked this law, the word cadere, and Caesar's famous name. The myth has endured because it's neat and memorable, a famous man lending his name to a dramatic medical practice. But the historical facts don't support it. Caesar entered the world the usual way, and his name is not the origin of the procedure. In reality, Caesarean sections became survivable for mothers only in much later centuries, with the advent of antiseptic practices and surgical advances. The story of Julius Caesar's birth is a reminder of how easily language can lead to historical myths, connecting unrelated threads into a tale that feels true but isn't. 33. The Great Fire of London ended the plague. A common belief is that the Great Fire of London in 1666 burned away the last traces of the bubonic plague that had devastated the city the year before. It's an appealing idea: fire-cleansing disease, destruction leading to renewal. But the timing and evidence don't support this neat connection. The plague of 1665 had already been declining before the fire began in September 1666. Disease outbreaks naturally ebb and flow, and by the time the fire swept through London, the epidemic had already largely subsided. Records from the bills of mortality, which tracked deaths in the city, show that plague deaths had dropped dramatically in the weeks before the fire. The fire itself devastated central London, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless businesses. But the neighborhoods hardest hit were not the plague-ridden suburbs, where the disease had been most concentrated. Instead, the poorest and most overcrowded areas, where rats and fleas thrived, remained relatively untouched. So where did the myth come from? Perhaps from the human need to find meaning in catastrophe. Linking the fire to the end of the plague creates a comforting story. That tragedy served a purpose. Victorian writers especially liked this narrative, framing it as divine cleansing or as evidence of progress through disaster. In truth, the decline of plague in London was likely due to a mix of factors: changes in rat populations, improved sanitation, and shifts in human immunity. The fire was transformative for London's architecture and infrastructure, but it did not single-handedly end the plague. 34. The Middle Passage was a relatively short and mild journey. Some accounts downplay the horrors of the Middle Passage, the forced transatlantic voyage of enslaved Africans to the Americas, by describing it as short or even survivable without major suffering. This is a dangerous myth that minimizes the immense brutality of the slave trade. In reality, the Middle Passage was one of history's most horrific ordeals. Ships packed enslaved men, women, and children into cramped, filthy holds with barely any space to move. Chains bound them together, disease spread rapidly, and food and water were scarce. Mortality rates were staggering. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 20% of those transported died during the journey. The voyage was anything but short. Depending on the route and weather, it could last from 6 weeks to several months. The psychological trauma was equally devastating, as captives were torn from their homelands and families, enduring violence, abuse, and the constant presence of death. The myth of a mild Middle Passage emerged in part from apologists for slavery, who sought to sanitize the trade by minimizing its cruelty. Even some textbooks in the 20th century described the passage in misleadingly neutral terms. Acknowledging the true horror of the Middle Passage is essential to understanding the transatlantic slave trade. It was not a brief or manageable journey, but a deliberately brutal system designed to dehumanize and control. To downplay it is to deny the suffering of millions whose lives were stolen by slavery. 35. The Berlin Wall went up overnight without warning. A popular image of the Cold War is that East Berliners woke up one morning in 1961 to find a massive concrete wall dividing the city. The truth is more gradual and complex. The barrier that became known as the Berlin Wall was indeed erected quickly, but it began as barbed wire and simple barricades. On August 13, 1961, East German authorities, backed by the Soviet Union, closed the border between East and West Berlin. Soldiers and workers unrolled barbed wire and placed roadblocks, effectively cutting the city in two. Over the following weeks and months, these makeshift barriers were replaced with concrete walls, guard towers, and fortified checkpoints. So while Berliners were shocked on that day to find movement suddenly restricted, the imposing concrete wall most people imagine was built in stages over years. The myth of overnight construction comes from the sudden shock of the border closure, not from the actual timeline of building. The wall symbolized the deep divide of the Cold War, physically separating families and communities for decades. But its creation was not a magical overnight event. It was the product of planning, labor, and reinforcement, growing steadily more formidable until it became the notorious symbol we remember. 36. Ancient Romans spoke in a refined, proper accent, like in films. Hollywood and theater productions have shaped how we think Romans sounded. Deep, polished English accents delivering Latin words with authority. But this is a myth born of performance, not linguistics. In reality, ancient Romans spoke Latin in a way that would sound very different to modern ears. Scholars reconstruct classical Latin pronunciation through comparisons with related languages, spelling patterns, and writings of Roman grammarians. For example, the C was always hard, like a K, so Caesar's name was pronounced Caesar, not Caesar. The letter V sounded like W, so Veni Vidi Vici would have been Weni, witty, witchy. As for accent, Latin was not spoken with the refined tones of British actors. It had its own rhythm and intonation, closer to Italian or Spanish than English. The myth of posh Romans emerged in part from Shakespearean theater, where Romans were portrayed by English actors using their natural speech. Hollywood later cemented this sound in epic films like Ben-Hur and Gladiator. The truth reminds us that ancient Rome was not a polished version of Britain, but a Mediterranean culture with its own distinct sound. The myth persists because it makes Latin feel grand and familiar, but in doing so, it distorts history. 37. The French Revolution was only about bread and hunger. It's often said that the French Revolution erupted because hungry peasants wanted bread. While food shortages did play a role, this simplification ignores the deeper causes of one of history's most transformative uprisings. In the late 18th century, France faced widespread inequality. The monarchy and nobility enjoyed immense privilege, while the majority of the population carried heavy taxes. Enlightenment ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity were spreading, challenging the very legitimacy of absolute monarchy. Yes, poor harvests in the 1780s and rising bread prices fueled anger, and Marie Antoinette's alleged "let them eat cake" remark became symbolic of elite indifference. But the revolution was about far more than bread. It was about justice, representation, and systemic reform. The myth of a bread revolt simplifies the revolution into a tale of hungry mobs rather than a complex political, social, and intellectual movement. In reality, it was driven by ideas as much as by hunger, and it reshaped Europe forever. 38. Native Americans lived in harmony with nature without conflict. There's a romanticized image of Native Americans as peaceful environmentalists who lived in perfect harmony with nature. While indigenous peoples often had deep respect for the land, this stereotype oversimplifies and distorts their history. Native societies were diverse, with hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and traditions. Many practiced sustainable agriculture, hunting, and fishing, but they also altered landscapes through controlled burns, irrigation, and farming. Far from untouched wilderness, much of North America had been shaped by indigenous practices. As for conflict, Native groups engaged in wars, raids, and rivalries long before European contact. Like all human societies, they balanced cooperation and competition. Reducing them to noble savages ignores their complexity and humanity. The myth of perfect harmony emerged in part from European colonizers, who used it to portray native peoples as simple, childlike, or destined to disappear. Later, environmental movements sometimes adopted the stereotype to contrast industrial society with an imagined past. The truth honors indigenous peoples more fully. They were skilled managers of their environments and complex political actors, not caricatures. Recognizing their diversity and agency helps undo centuries of myth-making. 39. World War I was triggered solely by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Textbooks often summarize the outbreak of World War I as a direct result of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. While the assassination in Sarajevo was the spark, it was not the sole cause of the war. Europe was already a powder keg. Rival alliances, militarization, nationalism, and colonial rivalries had been building tension for decades. The assassination gave Austria-Hungary an excuse to act against Serbia, but it was the network of alliances that turned a regional conflict into a global war. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. Russia supported Serbia. France and Britain were drawn in soon after. The myth of a single cause simplifies the war into an easy story. But in reality, the assassination was only the trigger. Without the underlying tensions, the event might have led only to a localized conflict. World War I was the result of deep systemic issues: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and diplomacy gone wrong. The assassination mattered, but it was just the final straw in a continent already primed for catastrophe. 40. The Titanic's sinking was completely unexpected and thought impossible. The story of the Titanic often includes the claim that the ship was widely believed to be unsinkable, making its 1912 disaster a shocking surprise. But this exaggerates contemporary beliefs. While promotional materials describe the Titanic as advanced and practically unsinkable, no serious engineers believed a ship was literally indestructible. The phrase unsinkable was used by journalists and marketers, not by shipbuilders. Many maritime experts recognize that any ship could sink under the wrong circumstances. When the Titanic struck an iceberg, it exposed flaws in its safety design, like too few lifeboats. But people were not universally shocked that a ship could sink. They were horrified that such a modern, luxurious liner had failed so dramatically. The myth of absolute confidence in Titanic's safety grew after the disaster, making the story more tragic. It turned the sinking into a morality tale of human hubris. The real lesson is not that people believed ships couldn't sink, but that overconfidence led to complacency in safety measures. 41. The Emancipation Proclamation instantly freed all enslaved people. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, newspapers across the Union declared it the great act of freedom. Many school books and popular retellings still suggest that with the stroke of a pen, Lincoln ended slavery in America. But the truth is far more complicated. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to enslaved people in states currently in rebellion against the United States. That meant areas still under Confederate control, places where Lincoln had no practical power to enforce the law at that moment. In loyal border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, slavery remained untouched. Even in some Confederate territories already under Union military occupation, such as parts of Louisiana and Virginia, enslaved people were not automatically freed. So why issue it at all? The proclamation was primarily a wartime strategy. By declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, Lincoln aimed to weaken the South's labor force while strengthening the Union with new recruits, as formerly enslaved men could now join the Union Army. Over 180,000 African Americans would go on to serve. The true end of slavery in the United States did not come until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865, months after Lincoln's assassination. The myth of instant liberation oversimplifies a painful, gradual process, one filled with resistance, delayed enforcement, and immense struggles by African Americans themselves to seize freedom in the midst of war. 42. Medieval knights lived by a strict code of chivalry. Knights in shining armor, swearing oaths of honor, protecting the weak, and treating ladies with courtesy. This is the romantic image we often associate with the Middle Ages. Movies and literature have painted knights as noble warriors bound by a strict code of chivalry, but reality was much rougher. The concept of chivalry emerged in the 12th century, influenced by both Christian teachings and aristocratic ideals. However, the code was more about regulating relationships between noblemen and women of their class than about protecting peasants or practicing kindness. In practice, knights were often brutal, serving lords in private wars, raiding villages, and engaging in feuds. Peasants rarely experienced the protection of knights. Instead, they were often the victims of knights' violence. Historical records show knights burning crops, stealing livestock, and even enslaving locals during conflicts. The courtesy to women part of chivalry applied only to noble women. Peasant women had no such protection. The romanticized version of chivalry was largely a literary invention. Troubadours and poets in France idealized knights in tales of courtly love. while later Victorian writers expanded the myth into the gallant, noble warriors we imagine today. In reality, knights were professional soldiers and enforcers of aristocratic power, far from the storybook heroes. 43. The Alamo was a glorious last stand for freedom. The Battle of the Alamo in 1836 has been immortalized as a heroic last stand by Texian rebels fighting for liberty against the tyranny of Mexico. School children in the U.S. are taught to remember the Alamo as a symbol of freedom, but the reality is more complicated. The Texian fighters at the Alamo were not simply fighting for independence. Many of them were also fighting to preserve slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but Anglo-American settlers in Texas continued to bring enslaved people with them. One of the key reasons for Texian discontent was Mexico's efforts to enforce abolition. The defenders of the Alamo, fewer than 200 men against thousands of Mexican soldiers, did resist bravely. But their cause wasn't purely noble. Many were American adventurers and filibusters who crossed into Texas illegally to grab land and resist Mexican authority. While their deaths became legendary, the framing of the battle as a fight for freedom leaves out whose freedom was actually at stake. Later, U.S. expansionists and propagandists turned the Alamo into a rallying cry for manifest destiny. By mythologizing the event, they justified westward expansion and glossed over the role of slavery and land seizure from Mexico. The Alamo was indeed a dramatic battle, but its legacy has been carefully reshaped to fit a heroic narrative. 44. The Cold War never turned hot. We often describe the Cold War as a conflict that never turned hot. In other words, it was a standoff of threats, spies, and nuclear brinkmanship, but no actual fighting between the superpowers. This description, however, erases the bloody reality experienced across much of the globe. The Cold War was fought through proxy wars, where the United States and the Soviet Union backed opposing sides in regional conflicts. In Korea, 1950, millions died in a war fueled by Cold War divisions. In Vietnam, the U.S. fought directly, resulting in millions of deaths. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded in 1970, and the U.S. funneled weapons to insurgents, sparking a brutal decade-long conflict. Beyond these major wars, smaller conflicts in Angola, Nicaragua, and other parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were fueled by Cold War rivalries. Coups, assassinations, and revolutions were often supported by one superpower or the other, leaving devastation in their wake. So while Washington and Moscow never fought each other directly on a battlefield, the Cold War was far from bloodless. It was hot for millions who found their homelands turned into battlegrounds for global power struggles. 45. Genghis Khan was only a ruthless killer with no achievements. Genghis Khan's name is often synonymous with mass slaughter. Popular imagination paints him solely as a brutal conqueror who left millions dead. While it's true that his campaigns caused immense destruction, this narrow view ignores the remarkable achievements of his empire. The Mongol Empire, founded in the early 13th century, became the largest contiguous empire in history. Genghis Khan established a merit-based system of leadership, promoting talented individuals, regardless of family background, a revolutionary concept in his time. He created a sophisticated communication network with relay stations and mounted couriers that allowed messages to travel quickly across thousands of miles. The Mongols standardized weights and measures, encouraged trade along the Silk Road, and promoted religious tolerance, allowing Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others to coexist within the empire. His conquests were brutal, yes, but they also connected vast regions of the world, facilitating cultural and economic exchange on an unprecedented scale. The myth of Genghis Khan, as nothing more than a ruthless killer, erases the complexity of his rule and the lasting global influence of his empire. 46. The Great Depression began overnight with the stock market crash of 1921. Ask most people when the Great Depression began, and they'll point to October 29, 1921. Black Tuesday, when the stock market crashed. The myth is that this single event triggered a sudden, worldwide collapse, but the reality was slower and more complex. The crash certainly signaled the start of trouble, wiping out fortunes and shattering confidence. However, the depression deepened gradually over several years. Bank failures, declining consumer spending, drought in the Midwest, the Dust Bowl, and misguided government policies all played major roles. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had soared to nearly 25%, but this was the culmination of years of economic unraveling, not an instant collapse. Globally, the depression spread as international trade declined. Debts from World War I weighed heavily, and gold standard policies made recovery harder. Countries like Germany and Britain suffered badly, leading to political instability that helped fuel the rise of fascism. The myth of an overnight collapse simplifies a complex chain of economic, political, and environmental factors that combine to create the deepest economic crisis of the 20th century. 47. All pirates made their victims walk the plank. Arr, matey, walk the plank. Moths is a staple of pirate movies and books, but the idea that pirates routinely forced captives to walk off a wooden plank into the sea is largely fiction. Historical records from the golden age of piracy, 17th, 18th centuries, contain very few references to plank walking. Most pirates preferred faster, more efficient methods of punishment, marooning captives on deserted islands, throwing them overboard, or simply killing them outright. The plank myth gained popularity in the 19th century thanks to adventure novels like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which helped shape the modern image of pirates. Stage plays and later Hollywood films cemented the idea. In reality, pirates were brutal but practical. They relied on fear to intimidate, but plank walking was too theatrical to be common practice. The myth survives because it fits the dramatic, swashbuckling image of pirates we've come to love in fiction. 48. The United States entered World War only after Pearl Harbor. The common story is that America was neutral until the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which suddenly thrust the nation into World War II. But the U.S. was already deeply involved before that day. By 1990, the U.S. was supplying Britain and other allies with weapons, ships, and supplies under programs like Lend-Lease. American naval forces were already patrolling the Atlantic, escorting convoys, and clashing with German submarines months before Pearl Harbor. In effect, the U.S. was waging an undeclared naval war against Germany. Roosevelt had also frozen Japanese assets and restricted access to vital materials like oil, escalating tensions with Tokyo. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the spark that officially brought America into the war, but it was not the start of involvement. The myth persists because Pearl Harbor provides a clear, dramatic moment of transition, but the reality is that America had already chosen sides long before December 1948. 49. Catherine the Great died in a bizarre accident with a horse. One of the most persistent rumors in European history is that Catherine the Great of Russia died in a scandalous accident involving a horse. The story goes that she attempted a sexual act with the animal, leading to her death. This is pure slander. Catherine actually died of a stroke in 1796 at the age of 67. The horse myth was invented by her political enemies, who sought to discredit her reign. As a powerful female ruler who had taken lovers and challenged traditional gender roles, she became an easy target for lurid gossip. The rumor spread widely in Europe, playing into misogynistic stereotypes of female rulers as unnatural or immoral. Over time, the false story overshadowed her real achievements, modernizing Russia, expanding its territory, supporting education, and patronizing the arts. The myth survives today because of its sensationalism, but it reveals more about the prejudices of her contemporaries than about Catherine herself. 50. The Stone Age was a time of cavemen who could barely survive. Say, Stone Age, and most people imagine brutish cavemen in animal skins, grunting and barely scraping by. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Stone Age peoples were resourceful and adaptable. They developed sophisticated tools, mastered fire, created art, such as cave paintings at Lascaux, and built social structures that allowed communities to thrive. They hunted large animals, gathered plants, and even began domesticating animals and crops in later stages, paving the way for agriculture. Far from being a time of constant struggle, the Stone Age saw significant cultural and technological innovation. Some scholars argue that early hunter-gatherers enjoyed more leisure time and healthier diets than many agricultural societies that followed. The caveman stereotype comes largely from early 20th century cartoons and popular media, which reduced a diverse, complex period of human history into a caricature. The truth is that Stone Age humans were the foundation of modern civilization, not mindless brutes. 51. The American Revolution was fought solely over taxes on tea. When school children in the United States learn about the American Revolution, the story often centers on taxation without representation and the Boston Tea Party. The simple tale goes like this. Britain taxed the colonists' tea, they revolted, and freedom was born. But the revolution was never just about tea or taxes. The reality was far more complex. The British Empire in the 1760s and 1770s was trying to manage its vast global possessions after the costly 7 Years' War. Taxes like the Stamp Act and Tea Act weren't just about revenue, they were symbols of imperial control. Colonists objected not only to paying taxes, but to the lack of representation in Parliament. They saw this as a challenge to their rights as Englishmen, but other factors mattered too. Land hunger played a major role. Many colonists wanted to expand westward, but British treaties with Native Americans restricted settlement beyond the Appalachians. For land speculators and settlers alike, Britain was a barrier to expansion. Slavery was also tied up in the Revolution. While many founding fathers spoke of liberty, the southern colonies were deeply concerned about Britain possibly interfering with slavery. The Somerset Case of 1772 in England, which effectively ended slavery on English soil, alarmed slaveholders who feared abolitionist sentiment might spread. So while tea taxes make for a simple rallying cry, the American Revolution was about much broader issues: sovereignty, land, slavery, and the nature of empire. The myth survives because it gives a clean, patriotic narrative, but it conceals the messy, contested roots of independence. 52. Napoleon was defeated because of the harsh Russian winter alone. One of the most enduring myths in European history is that Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 failed solely because of the brutal winter. The story paints the French as victims of nature rather than of their own mistakes. While the cold was indeed deadly, the truth is more complicated. Napoleon invaded Russia with a massive army of over 600,000 men, but even before winter set in, his forces were already collapsing. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, and the Russians employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and towns so the French could not find food. Starvation and disease killed tens of thousands. Desertion was rampant. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, he found the city largely abandoned and set aflame by its own inhabitants. With no supplies and no peace agreement from the Tsar, Napoleon lingered too long before retreating. By the time winter struck in full force, his army was already decimated. Yes, the Russian winter killed many, but so did hunger, exhaustion, poor planning, and relentless harassment by Russian forces. Of the 600,000 who began the campaign, fewer than 100,000 returned. To blame only the weather is to excuse Napoleon's own overreach and underestimate the effectiveness of Russian strategy. The myth persists because it offers a dramatic, simple explanation. But Napoleon's downfall in Russia was a mix of hubris, logistical failure, and relentless opposition, not just snow and ice. 53. The Berlin Airlift was a smooth, uncontested operation. The Berlin Airlift of 1948 to 1949 is remembered as a triumph of Western resolve during the early Cold War. When the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, the Allies supplied the city entirely by air, delivering food and coal until the blockade was lifted. The myth is that this was a seamless, almost heroic effort that went unchallenged. In truth, the operation was incredibly dangerous and fraught with tension. The Western Allies had to fly thousands of missions into Berlin every day, landing every few minutes at crowded airports. Pilots flew in all weather, sometimes through fog so thick they couldn't see the runways. Crashes were frequent. More than 70 Allied personnel died during the airlift. The Soviets also harassed the flights. They staged military exercises nearby, buzzed Allied planes with fighters, and sent balloons into the flight paths to disrupt operations. Though they avoided outright shooting, the threat of escalation was constant. Civilians in Berlin lived under immense stress, unsure if supplies would last or if war might break out. Despite the challenges, the Allies managed to deliver over 3 million tons of supplies, but it was not a smooth, uncontested mission. It was a tense gamble that could have tipped into open conflict at any moment. The myth of a flawless humanitarian operation overlooks the danger, sacrifice, and razor-thin margins of error. 54. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death and had no interest in daily life. The popular image of ancient Egypt centers on pyramids, mummies, and elaborate tombs. Many people assume the Egyptians were death-obsessed, pouring their culture into preparing for the afterlife rather than living in the present. This is a distortion created by archaeology and Hollywood alike. It's true that Egyptians invested heavily in funerary practices, but this was just one part of a vibrant culture. They also loved life. Wall paintings and inscriptions show scenes of music, dancing, banquets, and sports. Egyptians wrote poetry, celebrated festivals, and enjoyed board games like Senet. Their artwork often depicts joy, family, and community, not just death. The reason tombs dominate our understanding is simple. They survived. Everyday houses and palaces, made of mud brick, crumbled long ago. What endured were stone monuments and tombs filled with goods for the afterlife, which archaeologists then unearthed. That skewed picture has made us think Egypt was more funerary than it really was. In fact, Egyptians saw the afterlife as a continuation of life, which is why they stocked tombs with food, clothes, and games. Far from being morbid, their focus on death reflected an optimistic belief in eternal life. The myth of death obsession erases the Egyptians' joy, humor, and rich daily culture. 55. The Wild West was a lawless place of constant shootouts. Thanks to Hollywood westerns, many imagine the Wild West as a place where gunslingers roamed dusty streets, dueling daily in lawless towns. But historical evidence paints a much calmer picture. Shootouts like the famous gunfight at the OK Corral were rare. In fact, many frontier towns had strict gun control. Visitors were often required to check their weapons with the sheriff upon entering town. Most disputes were settled in courts, not through duels. Crime rates in many frontier towns were actually lower than in big eastern cities of the same era. Communities valued order, and local law enforcement, though sometimes corrupt, worked to maintain peace. Violence did occur, especially against Native Americans and within cattle disputes. But the idea of a lawless, chaotic frontier is exaggerated. The myth grew out of dime novels and traveling shows in the late 19th century, which dramatized frontier life for entertainment. Hollywood later amplified this image, creating iconic characters like Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid. The real West was filled with settlers, farmers, merchants, and families working to build communities. It was tough and often unjust, but not the endless bloodbath of legend. The myth survives because shootouts and desperados make for better stories than town councils and farming. 56. The Magna Carta granted modern democratic rights to everyone. The Magna Carta of 1215 is often hailed in popular memory as the foundation of democracy, the great charter that gave freedom and rights to the people of England. Tourists and school books sometimes describe it as if it were a medieval Bill of Rights, granting liberty and justice to all. This makes for a powerful image, the brave barons forcing the king to bow to the rule of law, and the dawn of modern democracy shining forth from a muddy field at Runnymede. The truth, however, is far less glamorous. The Magna Carta was not about democracy, nor was it about ordinary people. Instead, it was a peace treaty between a deeply unpopular King John and a group of rebellious barons. The barons were angry about heavy taxes, military failures, and the king's abuse of power. Their goal was not to empower peasants or townsfolk, but to secure their own privileges and protect their estates from royal interference. The famous clauses that survive in memory, trial by jury, the right to due process, the notion that no one is above the law, were originally narrow guarantees meant for the nobility, not the general population. Most of the Magna Carta was taken up with highly specific issues, such as the regulation of fishing weirs on rivers, debts owed to Jews, and the rights of widows of landowners. Even its immediate impact was limited. Pope Innocent III annulled the charter within weeks, declaring it invalid. Civil war soon erupted, and John died the following year. The document was reissued several times, each time with edits that made it less radical. Over the centuries, however, certain clauses were reinterpreted and reimagined, especially by 17th century English lawyers and later by American revolutionaries. It was they who breathed democratic life into the Magna Carta, framing it as a symbol of universal liberty. The myth persists because it offers a neat origin story, the birth of freedom in one defining moment. In reality, democracy and rights emerged slowly through centuries of struggle, revolution, and reform. The Magna Carta's true legacy lies not in what it was, but in what later generations imagined it to be, a symbol of liberty that outgrew its medieval roots. 57. Pocahontas saved John Smith and married him. The story of Pocahontas has been told and retold in countless plays, books, and films. The image of a young Native American woman throwing herself over Englishman John Smith to save him from execution, followed by their star-crossed romance, is one of the most enduring myths of early American history. Disney's animated film cemented this story for millions, turning it into a tale of love and cultural understanding. But this romantic version bears little resemblance to reality. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matawaka, was around 10 to 12 years old when she first encountered John Smith in 1607. Smith's famous account of being saved by her comes only years later, and many historians doubt it ever happened. It may have been a misunderstanding of a ritual, or a self-promoting invention by Smith himself, who had a tendency to dramatize his adventures. As for marriage, Pocahontas never wed John Smith. She later married John Rolfe, an English tobacco planter, in 1614. This marriage was politically motivated. It helped establish a period of peace between the English colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. Pocahontas converted to Christianity, taking the name Rebecca, and traveled to England, where she was presented at court as an example of a civilized native. Tragically, she died there in 1617 at around 21 years old. The myth survives because it offers a romanticized narrative of reconciliation between Native Americans and European settlers. In reality, colonization led to war, dispossession, and devastation for Native peoples. The story of Pocahontas has often been reshaped to comfort colonial guilt, presenting conquest as a love story rather than a violent upheaval. 58. The Wright brothers were the sole inventors of powered flight. Every schoolchild learns the story of Orville and Wilbur Wright, the humble bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio, who on December 17, 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, achieved the first powered, controlled flight. The Wright brothers are celebrated as the lone inventors of the airplane, their names forever linked to the birth of aviation. While it is true that the Wrights made a historic breakthrough, the myth lies in thinking they were completely alone in this endeavor. In reality, they were part of a global race. Inventors in Germany, France, Brazil, and the United States were all experimenting with flight at the same time. The Wrights' achievement was remarkable because they solved two key problems: controlled steering and sustained powered lift. But other pioneers, like Alberto Santos Dumont in France and Gustav Whitehead in Connecticut, also made significant contributions. And some claim they may have flown before the Wrights. The Wright brothers also did not immediately capture the world's imagination. For years after 1903, many people doubted their claims, since few had witnessed their flights. They were secretive, protecting their designs while filing patents. Meanwhile, European aviators staged public demonstrations that drew wide acclaim. By the time the Wrights were recognized internationally, the aviation field was already full of competitors. The myth persists because it's easier to tell a story with two heroes than with a messy network of inventors. The Wrights deserve enormous credit, but flight was not the product of two men working in isolation. It was the culmination of decades of worldwide trial and error and the beginning of a century of collective innovation. 59. The Spanish Armada was defeated only by bad weather. The story of the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 has long been simplified into a tale of divine intervention. God sent a storm to scatter King Philip II's invincible fleet, saving England from invasion. English propaganda at the time reinforced this myth, even minting medals inscribed with the phrase, "God blew," and they were scattered. While storms did play a role, the reality was far more complex. The English Navy, under commanders like Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake, used innovative tactics. Their ships were lighter and faster, able to outmaneuver the cumbersome Spanish galleons. English gunners also proved more effective, keeping their distance and bombarding the Armada rather than boarding in close combat. Spanish logistical problems compounded their defeat. Their plan relied on linking up with an army in the Netherlands, but communication failed, supplies ran low, and morale collapsed. After several battles in the Channel, the Armada was forced to retreat north around Scotland and Ireland, where storms indeed wrecked many ships. But by then, the English had already dealt significant damage. The myth of weather alone as the decisive factor persists because it simplifies a messy military campaign into a single, dramatic cause. It also fed into the idea of English destiny, that the nation was protected by divine will. In truth, the Armada's failure was a mixture of English strategy, Spanish mismanagement, and unfavorable weather. It was not a miracle, but a turning point born of human decision and natural chance alike. So, Mussolini made the trains run on time. One of the most enduring cliches about Benito Mussolini's fascist regime is that, despite his brutality, he at least made Italy's trains run on time. This phrase is often repeated as shorthand for authoritarian efficiency. The idea that dictators may be cruel, but they get things done. The reality is far less flattering. Italy's rail system had undergone major improvements before Mussolini came to power in 1922. Thanks to modernization efforts in the liberal governments of the early 20th century. Punctuality was already improving. Mussolini's regime claimed credit for these changes, amplifying minor adjustments into propaganda victories. In fact, under fascist rule, many trains were still late, overcrowded, or poorly maintained. Foreign visitors were shown carefully staged examples of efficiency. But ordinary Italians knew the truth. Fascism had not transformed the railway system into a model of precision. The myth persists because it offers a tidy narrative. Even the worst regimes bring order. But historians who have studied Italian rail records find no evidence of dramatic improvement. Mussolini's trains running on time is a triumph of propaganda, not of infrastructure. The phrase lives on because it captures a certain cynical humor, the idea of finding one silver lining in a dark cloud. But as history shows, even that silver lining was more illusion than fact. 61. King Tut's tomb carried a deadly curse. The story of the curse of King Tut is one of the most famous legends in archaeology. When Howard Carter and his team opened the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922, newspapers around the world claimed that those who entered would die mysterious deaths. Headlines screamed of an ancient Egyptian curse, warning against disturbing the dead. The most famous case was Lord Carnarvon, Carter's financial backer, who died a few months after the tomb's opening from blood poisoning caused by an infected mosquito bite. Journalists seized on this coincidence, spinning it into proof of supernatural vengeance. Over the next decade, every death of anyone even loosely connected to the excavation was reported as part of the curse. But the truth doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Most of the people present at the opening of the tomb lived long lives. Howard Carter himself died peacefully in 1939, 17 years later. Scientific studies of the supposed curse victims show no unusual pattern of premature deaths. The idea was largely invented by sensationalist newspapers eager to sell stories. There is, however, a small grain of fact. Sealed tombs can sometimes harbor dangerous mold spores or bacteria, which could affect health. But nothing about Tutankhamun's tomb suggests a plague-like danger. The myth persists because it plays on deep human fascination with mummies, magic, and the mysteries of ancient Egypt. it also conveniently shifts the focus away from colonial looting of antiquities, turning grave robbery into a tale of spooky justice. 62. Marco Polo brought pasta to Italy from China. Ask many people where pasta comes from, and they'll tell you that Marco Polo introduced it to Italy after his travels in China in the 13th century. This idea paints him as the man who brought noodles west, launching one of Italy's most iconic foods. But this is a myth. Long before Marco Polo, Italians and other Mediterranean peoples were already eating forms of pasta. Ancient Greeks and Romans prepared dishes of flat dough and sheets, while Arab traders introduced dried noodles to Sicily as early as the 9th century. Written records of pasta in Italy appear nearly 200 years before Marco Polo was even born. So, where did the story come from? It appears to have originated in a 20th century marketing campaign by the American spaghetti industry. A popular magazine article in the 1920s claimed, without evidence, that Polo had brought pasta home from China. The story stuck because it was exotic, simple, and easy to remember. The truth is more interesting. Pasta developed independently in different parts of the world. Chinese noodles, Mediterranean pasta, and Middle Eastern varieties share similarities but are not direct copies of one another. The myth persists because we like origin stories tied to famous names, even if reality is far more complex. 63. Betsy Ross designed the first American flag. The tale of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag is a staple of U.S. patriotic lore. According to legend, in 1776, George Washington personally approached Ross, a Philadelphia seamstress, and asked her to create the new nation's banner. She supposedly suggested the 5-pointed star design still seen today, and her work became the first American flag. Unfortunately, there is no historical evidence for this story. The earliest written claim comes nearly 100 years later, when Ross's grandson, William Canby, presented it in 1870 to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. By then, Ross was long dead, and no contemporary records supported the tale. Historians believe the first official flag was created in 1777 by Congress's Design Committee. Multiple seamstresses likely worked on different versions, but there is no proof that Ross had a special role. The myth gained traction in the late 19th century during a surge of patriotic nationalism, when Americans wanted heroic, relatable figures in their founding stories. The Betsy Ross tale persists because it offers a symbolic, personal touch to the nation's beginnings. The image of an ordinary woman sewing the symbol of freedom resonates deeply. While Ross was a real person and a flag maker, the legend exaggerates her role. The first flag was not the work of one seamstress, but of a broader revolutionary effort. 64. The Liberty Bell rang on July 4, 1776. The Liberty Bell is one of the most iconic symbols of American independence. Popular imagination insists that it rang out triumphantly in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, its cracks somehow adding to its symbolism. The reality, however, is different. The Declaration was adopted on July 4th, but was not publicly read until July 8th. That was the day church bells rang across the city in celebration, but no record exists of the Liberty Bell being rung specifically. In fact, the bell was not referred to as the Liberty Bell until the 19th century, when abolitionists adopted it as a symbol for their movement. The famous crack also came later. Historians believe the bell developed hairline fractures through use and finally broke beyond repair in the 1840s. The myth that it rang on Independence Day was popularized in children's books and patriotic stories written in the 1800s, particularly as Americans sought to build national identity around vivid, emotional imagery. The truth is less cinematic. The bell may not have rung at all in 1776, yet the myth persists because it ties the symbol directly to the birth of the nation. A cracked bell that never rang on the Day of Independence would not be nearly as stirring as the legend we continue to tell. 65. Benjamin Franklin proved electricity by flying a kite in a thunderstorm. The image of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a lightning storm, a key tied to its string, is one of the most famous stories in science history. In the popular version, lightning strikes the kite, travels down the string, and Franklin discovers electricity. It's dramatic, simple, and unforgettable, but the reality is both more cautious and less magical. Franklin never intended to be struck by lightning. That would have killed him instantly. What he actually did in 1752 was fly a kite during a storm to collect ambient electrical charge from the air. A metal key attached to the string attracted this charge, and Franklin observed sparks when he touched it. This was evidence that lightning and static electricity were the same phenomenon. The danger was still real, but Franklin's experiment was designed to avoid a direct lightning strike. Later versions of the story exaggerated it into a near-suicidal act of genius. In truth, Franklin's work was part of a broader international scientific effort. Experiments in Europe, especially by Thomas-François Dalibard in France, had already tested lightning's electrical nature using grounded metal rods. The myth persists because it captures Franklin's image as a daring, homespun genius. It also makes for a powerful story, one man with a kite unlocking the secrets of the skies. The reality was careful, methodical science. Still impressive, but less like a Hollywood drama.